Hilda, Chapter 5 Resistance. The room was dim, the only light coming from the small lamp set in the center of the wooden table. Dust floated lazily in the faint yellow glow, creating an almost ethereal effect in the darkened corners. I sat with my back straight, hands resting in my lap, careful not to fidget or show any sign of unease. Not that anyone would notice. Paul was the center of attention. His voice had a way of gripping the room, every word filled with purpose, every pause calculated. The group had already gone silent the moment he stood up. His tall frame cast a shadow against the wall, and I couldn't help but notice how his eyes never lingered on any of us for too long, always scanning the room as if trying to gauge the collective spirit of those who sat before him. Paul took a breath before beginning, his fingers drumming on the back of his chair. "We are here today because we refuse to be complicit," he began, voice low but forceful. "We are here because there are lines that can no longer be crossed, because we see what is happening to our friends, to our families, and to people like Johannes." My stomach clenched at the mention of Johannes. It had been months since we'd last heard from him. No one really knew where he was, or if he was still alive. I felt the familiar pang of guilt for not being able to do more for him, for all of them. Paul's gaze was on the table now, tracing patterns in the wood as he continued. "Each of us has our own reasons for being here. Some come because of family, people taken, people killed. Others come because they can no longer stand to look at themselves in the mirror knowing they have done nothing." His voice grew more intense, his eyes narrowing as he looked at us. "But know this, we are not here just for ourselves, we are here for every silent voice in this country." I could hear the shuffling of feet beside me, subtle shifts in the room as everyone listened, some nodding in agreement, others staring at the floor. To my right was Lena, her arms crossed over her chest, eyes hard and focused. She was one of the most vocal members of the group, always the first to jump into action, always ready to argue a point with Paul. On my left, Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees, nodding slightly to each of Paul's words. He looked worn, eyes hollow, a far cry from the lively boy he once was before the war changed everything. "We are fighting a war on two fronts," Paul continued, his voice rising now. "One with state and the other with ourselves. Every day we wake up, we choose whether to give in to the fear or to push through it. Every day we make that decision. And I won't lie to you, it's going to get harder." The Gestapo was watching. Neighbors are turning on neighbors. He paused, locking eyes with each of us in turn. "But we still have a choice. We always have a choice." The room was heavy with silence as his words sank in. For a moment, it felt as if the air had thickened, making it hard to breathe. I thought about the protests we'd organized, the leaflets we had secretly distributed, the nights spent hiding in dark alleys, always looking over our shoulders. So much of our work had been in shadows and whispers, but Paul was right. We had chosen this path, and we had to keep choosing it, no matter how dangerous it became. "Our mission has never been clearer," Paul said, his voice softening slightly. "We stand for freedom, for truth, and we will not stop until the lies this regime is built upon are exposed for the world to see. We are here to show that there are still Germans who will not bow to the Reich." His hands gripped the back of the chair tightly, knuckles white. "And we will not be silenced." There was a shift in the room, a murmur of agreement from the others. I could see Leonard's jaw set with determination, and Marcus straightened his posture slightly, as if Paul's word had physically lifted him. I felt the familiar steel of resolve in my chest, the feeling that had first brought me here, that had kept me coming back, even when I was afraid, even when I thought of what could happen to my family if they found out. Paul's eyes softened as he looked around us, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. "This is not just about survival. This is about fighting for a future where we are not defined by fear, by hatred, a future where people like Johannes can live freely." I heard someone shuffle in the back, Probably Otto, who was known for his restless energy. He had a habit of pacing when things got too intense. I glanced over him, noting the familiar agitation in his expression. Otto had lost his brother to the camps, and his anger sometimes boiled over in ways that worried me, but tonight even he was quiet, focused. We must also be prepared for the cost, Paul continued, his voice lowering again. This fight will not come without sacrifice. You've all heard the stories. People disappearing in the night, families torn apart, lives destroyed. He paused, the weight of his words settling on the group like a blanket of dread. We have all lost something. Some of us will lose more. But we do this because we must, because if we do nothing, then who will? Paul let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again. We have a new mission, he said, his tone shifting, becoming more practical now. There's a supply line we've learned about, one that's feeding the war machine, keeping the army supplied with weapons. We've received word that it's vulnerable. If we can sabotage it, even temporarily, we can delay their shipments, buy time for those fighting on the front. I could see the others strain up at the mention of action. This was why we were here, to fight back, to do something. Paul outlined the plan, his voice calm but firm, going over the details, the timing, the risks. It would be dangerous, but then everything we did was dangerous. As the meeting drew to a close, Paul's final word hung in the air. Remember why you're here, remember what we're fighting for, and know that, no matter what happens, we stand together. The group slowly began to disperse, murmurs of conversation filling the room as people gathered their things, preparing to head out into the night. I stayed seated for a moment, my mind still processing Paul's speech. The weight of it all felt heavier than ever, but despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't alone in this. As long as we stood together, there was hope. I remember the first real mission like it was yesterday. It was the kind of night where the cold pierced through your skin down to your bones, and yet none of us noticed. We were too full of adrenaline, too caught up in the moment to care about the frost creeping up the windows or the wind that howled outside. Paul had gone over the plan countless times, but the closer we got to the day, the more the doubt started to settle in. Not for Paul, of course. He never wavered, at least not outwardly. His steady, calm demeanor kept us all grounded, even when I saw the worry etch into Lena's face or the way Marcus' hands shook when he thought no one was looking. It was Paul's belief in us that kept us together, that gave us the courage to carry out what we had only spoken about in hushed tones. The target was a weapon depot in a nearby town, small enough to go unnoticed but significant enough to disrupt the supply chain if we could pull it off. We were to sabotage the storage, disabling a shipment meant to leave at dawn. Otto had drawn up the logistics. It was clear, precise. We knew the risk. One misstep and it would be over. I was terrified, though I tried my best not to show it. I kept my eyes on the road ahead as we made our way through the winding paths, listening to the sound of footsteps on the gravel. Paul walked in the front, always leading. Lena was beside me, her breath visible in the cold air. She caught my eye once, gave me a short nod, as if to say, "We're in this together." When we reached the depot, the tension was unbearable. I could hear every rustle, every small creak from the trees as we crept closer. Otto stayed at the lookout, crouched near the entrance while Paul and Marcus prepared the charges. My job was simpler, at least it seemed so on paper. I was to wait by the back, keep an eye on the guards' rotations, and signal if anything went wrong. Time felt like it stretched on forever. Every second felt like an eternity as I crouched behind the crates, my hands shaking, gripping the signal's whistle tightly. I could hear the faint voices of the guards as they passed by, oblivious to the danger just meters away. I kept thinking about what would happen if they saw me, if they saw us. There would be no talking our way out of this. This was war after all, and yet there we were, students, farmers, a mix of people who had never imagined themselves in such a position, fighting the might of Nazi regime. The seconds passed, 10 minutes, and just when I thought I couldn't stand it any longer, I heard it, the low thud of the first charge going off. It wasn't loud, not like I had expected, but the impact was enough. The lights around the depot flickered, and I heard the shouts of confusion from the guards. My heart raced. For a split second, I thought about running, about abandoning the mission and disappearing into the night. But then I remembered Paul's words, how he said we had to choose every day to stay in the fight. The second charge went off, and I watched as the smoke began to rise from the far side of the teapot. Paul and Marcus emerged from the shadows, their faces set, determined. Otto waved us forward, signaling the coast was clear. We ran fast. My legs felt like they were barely touching the ground as we sprinted back into the cover of the trees, the sound of the chaos behind us fading with every step. When we reached the safe house, breathless and wide-eyed, the realization hit us all at once. We had done it. We had actually done it. The mission was a success. Lena was the first to break the silence, a breathy laugh escaping her lips. It was the sound of disbelief of relief. Otto had joined in, clapping Marcus on the back. Even Paul, ever stoic, allowed himself a small smile as we huddled around the table, catching our breath. "We did it," Marcus said, his voice barely a whisper. "We really did it." Paul nodded, his face still serious, but I could see the pride in his eyes. "This is only the beginning," he said. "There will be more victories like this." And there were small ones at first. Each mission we carried out seemed to embolden us, make us believe that maybe, just maybe, we could make a difference. We targeted supply lines, sabotaged communications, anything that could slow down the war effort. It wasn't enough to stop the machine, but it was enough to send a message, to show that there were still people in Germany who refused to be silent. But it wasn't always easy. There were close calls, too many to count. I still remember the night Otto nearly didn't make it back. We had been trailing a convoy, planning to intercept a shipment of rations meant for the front lines. Everything had gone according to the plan until the guards spotted Otto. I can still see the panic in his eyes as he scrambled to get away, bullets whizzing past him as he ran. We waited for hours that night, terrified that we'd lost him, only for him to show up at the hideout, covered in mud, a wild grin on his face. He had managed to escape into the woods, eluding the guards by sheer luck. It was nights like that when I questioned whether we could keep going, whether it was all worth it, the danger, the fear, the constant dread being discovered. But then I would think of Johannes, of the letters we never received, and I knew I couldn't stop. None of us could. The protests were different, though. They were public, defiant, a chance for us to show our faces, to stand up in broad daylight and say no more. We were careful, of course, always careful. The posters we printed late at night, the messages scrawled on the walls, the flyers dropped from the rooftops, they all carried a risk, but we couldn't stay hidden forever. One protest in particular stands out in my memory. It was the first time we came close to being caught. We had gathered in the town square, a group of us blending in with the crowd, holding signs that called for peace, for freedom. It wasn't long before the authorities arrived and the crowd began to scatter. I remember the fear that gripped me as I ran, the sound of boots on cobblestone growing louder behind me. Lena and I ducked into an alley, our hearts pounding in our chests. We stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the shouts of the officers as they searched the streets. We had escaped, but only barely. Not all of us were so lucky. Some were taken, dragged from their homes in the dead of night. Faces we had come to know, to trust, vanished without a trace. Their absence was a contrast reminder of the cost of resistance. But through it all, we kept going, for Johannes, for the others who could no longer fight. We carried their memory with us, their spirit fueling our actions, reminding us that even in the darkest times there was still hope. Paul's speeches grew longer, more impatient as the months went on. He spoke of revolution, of the day when the Reich would fall and we would be free, and we believed him even as the war raged on, even as the losses mounted, we believed. Because what else could we do? We were already in too deep, and there was no turning back. It was still dark when I woke, the room around me bathed in the pale blue light of early morning. For a moment, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. Maybe a dream, or the familiar sound of the wind against the old window panes, but then I heard it, a voice, deep, commanding, and unmistakably familiar. My father's voice. I sat up in bed, my heart quickening as the reality of it hit me. He was home. I hadn't seen him in months, longer than I could remember. He had been away, stationed somewhere along the Western Front, or so he had told us in his last letter. I had almost forgotten the sound of his voice, the way it filled a room, always so sure of itself, so full of authority. I slipped out of bed quietly, pulling on a sweater over my nightgown as I made my way down the hallway. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and for a moment I hesitated, but then I heard my mother's voice too, muffled, greeting him with a mixture of relief and weariness. I hurried the rest of the way. There he was, standing in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. He looked the same, though maybe a little older, his uniform pressed neatly, the sharp lines of the Nazi insignia glinting down his collar. His face broke into a broad smile when he saw me, and without warning, he crossed the room in a few quick strides and enveloped me in a tight hug. "Hilda," he said, his voice rumbling in his chest as he held me close. "Look at you, you've grown." I wanted to say something, but my throat felt tight. My words caught somewhere between surprise and unease. I hadn't expected him, hadn't prepared myself for the rush of emotions that came with seeing him again. Instead, I nodded and managed a small smile as he pulled away to look at me. "You're up early," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "Come, let's eat. I've missed my family." We gathered in the kitchen, the way we used before everything changed. The table was set with bread and butter, cold cuts, and fresh eggs my mother must have prepared early before she got to sleep the night before. The smell of coffee filled the air, and for a moment I let myself relax into the familiarity of it all, the way things had been before the war, before the resistance, before everything became so complicated. My father sat at the head of the table, his back straight, his presence commanding even in the comfort of our home. He talked about his time away, about the victories of the Wehrmacht, and how the war was progressing. He didn't ask about me or about my life, and I was grateful for it. I didn't want him to know, couldn't let him know. I watched him as he spoke, his hands gesturing as he recounted the stories of battles, of soldiers, of his duty to Reich. My stomach twisted at his words, the casual way he spoke of the things that haunted my nightmares, but I kept my face neutral, smiling where I needed to, nodding along as if I were the same girl who had looked up to him all those years ago. After breakfast, my father disappeared into the small office at the back of the house, his papers spread out across the desk. He had been busy all morning, coming in and out of the room, his brow furrowed in concentration. I watched him from the doorway for a moment before I gathered the courage to ask, "Dad, what are you working on?" He glanced up at me, his expression softening slightly. "Important work, Hilda. There are people, dangerous people that need to be found. Traitors to the fatherland. We've got leads, but they've been hard to catch." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and cold. Dangerous people, traitors. The room seemed to spin for a moment, my thoughts colliding with the reality of what he was saying. My father, my own father, was hunting people like me, people like Paul, like Lena, like Otto. I swallowed hard, nodding as if I understood, as if I didn't feel like the ground had just crumbled beneath my feet. The day passed in a haze, my mind spinning with what my father had said. I went through the motions, doing my chores, to school, talking with Bauer, pretending everything was fine. As evening fell, I slipped out of the house under the guise of running an errand. My heart pounded in my chest as I made my way through the darkened streets, the cold air biting at my skin. The basement where we met was hidden beneath an old shop, the kind of place no one paid attention to. When I arrived, Otto was already there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He nodded at me as I walked in. "What's up?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing," and I sat beside him. "I mean, my father's back. He was saying weird things today. He's, looking for people, resistance members like us." Otto's face paled, but before he could say anything, the door creaked open and Paul stepped inside, followed by Lena and Marcus. The rest of the group filled in shortly after, their faces tired, worn from weeks of planning and evading the authorities. We gathered around the small table, our voices hushed as we discussed their next steps. Paul was in the middle of explaining the logistics of our next mission when it happened. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and before any of us could react, the room was filled with the Gestapo officers, black uniforms, shining boots, and cold, unfailing eyes. My heart stopped, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. "Get down!" Paul shouted, but it was too late. They swarmed the room, grabbing everyone in sight. Lena screamed as two officers pulled her to the ground, her hands twisted behind her back. Marcus tried to fight, but he was outnumbered. His body slammed against the wall before he could even land a punch. I scrambled backwards, my mind racing as I looked for a way out. There, a small crawl space behind the shelves. I darted towards it, ducking down just as Otto followed suit. We squeezed into the narrow gap, our bodies pressed against the cold, damp walls as we held our breath, praying they wouldn't find us. Through the slats of the shelves, I watched in horror as the rest of the group was dragged out one by one, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear, and then, through the chaos, I saw him, my father. He strode into the room, his face hard and unforgiving, his eyes scanning the face of the captured, and then his gaze landed on Paul. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. I could see the recognition in Paul's eyes, the way he straightened his back, even in the face of my father's cold stare, and then, without warning, my father lunged forward, his fist connecting with Paul's jaw with a sickening crack. Paul stumbled, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth, but he didn't fall, he didn't beg, he didn't plead. He just stared back at my father, his eyes full of defiance. "You think you can destroy us?" My father spat, his voice low and dangerous. Paul said nothing. He just stood there, silent, his chest rising and falling with labored breath. My father hit him again and again, and each blow harder than the last, the sound of fist against flesh filling the room. I wanted to scream, to run out and stop him, to do anything to make it stop, but I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. All I could do was watch as my father, the man I had once looked up to, beat the person that I had come to trust the most. When it was over, Paul's body crumpled to the ground, motionless. My father stood over him, breathing heavily, his face stained with blood. He wiped his hand on his uniform, his face calm, emotionless as if nothing had happened. "Take them away," he said coldly, and the officers obeyed, dragging Paul and the others out of the room. I stayed hidden, my body trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know how long I stayed there, frozen in place, but by the time I finally emerged, the room was empty, save for the bloodstains on the floor. Otto was beside me, his face pale, his hands shaking. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We were the only ones left. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I didn't remember how I got home, or how I managed to act normal when my father returned, his uniform spotless, his face unreadable. I lay in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my father's face, bloodied, and bruised, crashing into Paul's face over and over again. This image haunted me, pulsing in my mind like a fresh wound. The house was quiet, as it always was at this hour. My mother had gone to bed early. I had barely spoken to her since coming back, afraid that she might see something in my eyes, something that would give me away. My father had stayed in his office after dinner, poring over his papers, and I had been grateful for the distance. But now, as I lay there, I heard the unmistakable sound of voices downstairs. At first, I thought I might be imagining them, but then the voices grew louder, clearer. One of them was my father's, deep and authoritative, but the other belonged to someone else, someone unfamiliar. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Hasn't broken, the unfamiliar voice saying, tone sharp and impatient. We've tried everything, torture, isolation, he won't give them up. The girl and the boy are still out there. My heart raced and the blood pounding in my ears. I slipped out of bed, moving quietly to the door. Slowly I cracked it open, just enough to hear it better. Paul, I whispered under my breath, my body trembling with the weight of his name. They were talking about him, about the torture he was enduring, the agony he must have been going through at the very moment. My stomach twisted at the thought of it, but I forced myself to keep listening. We need those names, the unfamiliar voice continued. The flawless orders are clear, no traces can be allowed to escape. If those two manage to stay hidden, they'll become symbol of resistance. We can't let that happen. There was a pause, and I heard the faint clink of a glass being set down at a table. Then my father's voice, calm and controlled, cut through the silence. I know, he said, and we will find them. It's only a matter of time. Paul is strong, but everyone breaks eventually, and when he does, we'll know exactly where to look. There was something in his tone, something dark and final, that sent a chill down my spine. We can't wait too long, the other man pressed. The longer they're out there, the more dangerous they become. Every day they remain free is a day they could be spreading their lies, recreating more sympathizers. My father sighed, and I could hear the frustration in his voice, though he tried to mask it. We'll kill them as soon as we find them, my father said, his voice loud and cold. No trial, no mercy, they'll be made examples of. My heart stopped. Kill them. He was talking about me, about Otto. I didn't know it, but the boy and the girl who had escaped, the ones Paul had refused to betray, were us. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from gasping, to keep the terrors from spilling out of me. My body shook with the effort. Paul was protecting us, even under torture. He hadn't given us up, but how long could he hold out? How long before the pain became too much? Before he broke and told them everything? The thought was unbreakable. I'll have men stationed near the city outskirts, the other man said, his tone clipped and businesslike. Just in case then they try to flee, we can't let them slip through our fingers. I'll see to it personally, my father replied. As soon as we have the names, it will be over. There was the sound of chairs scraping back, and I realized with a jolt that they were getting up. I stumbled back from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't let them find me standing there. I couldn't risk them knowing what I'd overheard. I slipped back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin, trying to control my breathing as I had the front door open and then close again. The stranger was leaving, but my father remained. I could hear his footsteps moving around downstairs, slow and deliberate. He had just ordered my death. I lay there, motionless, waiting for what felt like hours until I heard my father climb the stairs and head to his room. Only when I was certain he would sleep did I slip out of bed and grab my coat. My hands shook as I pulled it in, but I forced myself to move quietly, carefully. I couldn't stay here, not anymore. With one last glance at the room I had grown up in, I slipped out into the night.